I am Jessie Kasner. I am the Chief Marketing Officer for Flora Growth. As you know, we do these State of Play webinar series periodically throughout the year to address the goings-on in the cannabis industry, both from a domestic perspective as well as international. Today, we have switched up the format a little bit, inviting some of the industry's most influential people to discuss the changing regulatory landscape, which, as we know, is changing seemingly on an hourly basis at this point. But today we're going to touch on some of the nuances of the regulatory changes that have been proposed, as well as what we might expect across the next few years in terms of the evolving cannabis landscape. So with that, I will begin by introducing our panel. So of course, we have Holly Bell, Flora's VP of Regulatory Affairs with us. Holly is also Florida's former Director of Cannabis at the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. We also have Anthony Pardal, Vice President of the Office of Strategic Engagement and co-lead of the Cannabis Working Group at the American Bankers Association. The ABA, of course, being the voice of the nation's nearly $24 trillion banking industry. We have Erin Moffet with us today. She serves as the Director of Strategic Communications and Policy Advisor for the Liaison Group, DC's only lobbying firm focused exclusively on the cannabis industry. She's also the Director of Policy and Communications for the Cannabis Financial Industry Group, which coalesces financial institutions and associated service providers serving the regulated U.S. cannabis industry. Erin is, we're really glad to have her here. She has more than 12 years of congressional and state government experience working to move federal cannabis reform forward. So thank you for being here. And then we have Zachary Korbin, which of course recognized nationally as one of the top lawyers in the cannabis industry. He previously served as general counsel for 2 public multi-state operators and is currently a partner at Akerman LLP, specializing in cannabis industry matters. Akerman, of course, is an AmLaw 100 law firm and was one of the first large law firms in the U.S. to have dedicated cannabis practice. So thank you all again so much for being here, especially given the chaotic week and likely few months you guys have all been in the middle of with midterms just finalizing on Tuesday. So thank you again for being here. We all really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So with that, I'll just remind our participants who are on that we do have the Q&A function turned on. We also have the raise hand function turned on. So we're going to do our best to leave a bit of time at the end of this conversation to take some audience questions. So go ahead and use that as needed, and we'll loop back at the end. So obviously Tuesday, a big day with some interesting news coming down with different ballot measures impacting the cannabis industry. So one stat that I found really shocking, and I don't think that we put it into context enough, but according to New Frontier data, with the passage of Maryland's Question 4 and then Missouri's Amendment 3 ballot measures, it means that 48% of Americans now live in states having legalized recreational cannabis, and 74% of the country now has legal access to either adult use or medical cannabis. Which is really staggering. A huge majority of our country now has access to cannabis, which I think is really positive. But there were still 3 other states with cannabis ballot measures that voted down any level of legalization. Each individual state had their own language that they were evaluating. But is there anything that we can discern or that there is to be learned from some of these states that continue to hold out on any level of cannabis access for their population?
Erin, I can get us started. I mean, I think they need to read the room per se, honestly. You mentioned we have now 21 states with the 2 states that passed. The other 3 states that did not pass, when it comes to ballot initiatives, that's not necessarily reflective of support, because ballot initiatives have to meet certain thresholds. They can't go into too much detail. They become very difficult. And I know in Arkansas, they're already going to try again. What I would also flag is the fact that in localities, in some very red places, we saw cities in Ohio, several cities in Texas, several municipalities in Wisconsin, and in Rhode Island, 33 cities had decrim policies on the ballot, and 25 of those passed. And it's those incremental steps we're seeing even on the local level that are really going to send a message to folks that like you're falling behind here. You have folks that need access to something that they may leave your state or municipality to access it. You're missing out on job opportunities and growth. And as this trajectory continues, those states are just getting further and further behind. So I think even looking down on that local level really sends a message to the states that are holding out and to the elected officials at the top that are being the blocking of these changes, that they need to get with the times or they're going to be left behind when it comes to how states are moving and addressing cannabis reform.
That's a very polite way of putting it.
What's the less polite way of putting it? We're all friends here.
Completely obstinate. I liken it to the gambling industry. And I'm in Florida, and I joke with people that 25 years ago, if you were a hardline conservative and you were pro-gambling, you were voted out of office. Now, if you're a hardline conservative and you're anti-gambling, you're voted out of office. And the one constant is, in addition to everything Erin just mentioned, is the tax revenue. When people start seeing the ability to raise that much revenue, it just seems miraculously their objections seem to float away. I think certain states, Arkansas was going to be a heavy lift. We were just joking before we went on that South Dakota voted it down after voting it up, but that measure was, for lack of, to use a legal term of art, a very wonky measure the way they had it this year. North Dakota, I think, was going to be a heavy lift. But the stat that you mentioned is really telling, that it's not just the majority, but a serious majority of Americans are in areas that not only recognize but embrace legal cannabis in some form. I do think that look, Florida's a perfect example. It baffles me that states like Missouri and Virginia are adult use before Florida is, but politics ultimately comes down to the local level and who's in power, and eventually people will see that beyond the ideological issues of it, this is a pure business play. Colorado is making a lot of money. Illinois is making a lot of money, plain and simple. So.
And I would imagine, you guys have your finger on the pulse, and a lot of times, we're whispering in the ear of the people who are making these policy decisions, both at the local level as well as at the federal level. And so, what does it take to move the needle for some of these holdout states? To your point, Zach, like there is so much revenue just kind of sitting out there, and state by state, I mean, there is a critical need for infusions of cash at almost every level of local government. So what then is the holdout? Because I think, we sit on this side as sort of cannabis insiders and say that there's a lot of money to be made because people need, beyond want it, in a lot of cases need this product, this medicine, in most, in a lot of people's cases. So, how do we move the needle there?
I think what Erin mentioned earlier was really important, and that was about ballot initiatives. A lot of these things came through ballot initiatives this session. And the downside to that is it's really difficult to kind of parlay that in some ways. Sometimes it works out, but oftentimes it doesn't. And what we found, what we've heard, is sometimes that either has one of two effects. It really spurs legislators into action because they don't want voters necessarily determining what these laws will look like. And in other cases, fewer, but some, it almost like emboldens them not to act because they get offended that it was going this other route, or they think it's an easier way out, so that in some of these more conservative states, or municipalities, they don't want to have to answer to their constituents about the moral arguments related to cannabis, whatever they may or may not be. So I think that that's important because we're coming off this cycle where, again, we added a couple more states to the mix. I think it's beyond a tipping point now, as we referenced earlier, 77. I heard as high as 77. I know you referenced 74. Percent of Americans being in these areas that now offer this. So I think what we're starting to see, I think with the president's actions on the federal level, with continued thought on the federal level, with states bringing in massive amounts of income. I think that will long-term be the play, but right now we have to also remember that with ARPA funds, most states are sitting on a boatload of money right now. So their budget crunches haven't hit, and they probably won't hit for another year or two if they do decide to materialize. So I think that in and of itself has kind of slowed the development, but that's not to say that it's the deciding factor at this point.
Yeah, I think it's also important that a lot of people need to recognize is that with almost any kind of ballot measure, there's two types of ballot measures, these self-implementing and the ones that require legislative reform. And self-implementing ballot measures, again, Florida is a perfect example. In this industry, because cannabis is so dependent on being regulatory, it doesn't work. So every one of these ballot measures is going to require legislative action. So while it is a great day when more states turn, and this is the glass half empty, glass half full conversation, but everyone should also recognize Maryland's not selling adult use tomorrow. It's going to take time. Missouri is not selling adult use tomorrow. It's going to take time. And there is a continued fight going on because now it's the working, I don't want to say fighting, but working with your legislators to craft legislation that complies with what these ballot measures said, but also does it in an expeditious manner. Too many times these things get completely dragged out, and inevitably what you have is like, look at New York. New York said, oh, we're going to have first sales before the end of the year. We're going to rush it through. What happens then is you are literally making it up on the fly. New York put out had an application round and then changed the guidance to basically tell, MSOs they can't come in, or, you can't be vertically integrated. So it is one of those things where people have to understand there's a need for patience, because you have to be methodical. And what you don't want is to implement something for the sake of implementing something, to go back a year or two later to fix your problems.
Like Minnesota, right, Zach?
What's that?
And I know you talked about New York, but Minnesota, right? Minnesota this last session miraculously legalized marijuana, but they didn't. In doing so, they didn't really realize A, that they did, if you believe some of the legislators, and B, when in doing so, they didn't put any regulatory or policing authority, any kind of anything behind it. So now they're kind of stuck in this limbo where if you're 21, you can essentially sell marijuana, but you can't buy it. And so there's all of these like weird little quirks that happen when you kind of legislate on the fly as it relates to this.
Yeah, and that's, I hate to say where the sausage making really comes into play on the state level politics. It's definitely one of those things where everyone, I keep telling people, take a deep breath. This is the time when you have to dig in and actually do the work. You thought it was hard to get a ballot measure passed. The real difficulty is going to be convincing 120 or 200 or 180 legislators to pass a measure that does what you need it to do and benefits, a compromise. It represents a compromise. So great things, but everyone should also take a deep breath and realize there's still work to do.
Well, and speaking of the work that needs to be done, I think there's a thought right now that there are two things hanging out there that will just completely change the cannabis industry. We have rescheduling and safe banking. And so I want to pick your guys' brains a little bit on that. And I'll start with rescheduling, although one certainly informs the other. So obviously we all know the president had recommended that there is work to be done around evaluating cannabis and rescheduling it from Schedule I narcotic to something else. What that is remains to be seen. You guys probably have more intel there than I do. But I think what would be helpful, and Erin and Holly, I know you guys are pretty tuned into this, but can you give us just a quick overview of sort of what the actual process of evaluating how cannabis is scheduled, like what that's going to look like and who's involved?
I'll start and let Erin finish up, but basically the Secretary of Health has been tasked with reviewing it, investigating it, evaluating it, and he has to do that in a reasonable time, right, Erin? Yeah. There is no definitive days, months attached to that. So then he writes a report, sends it to the Attorney General. Then the Attorney General writes up his recommendation and sends it on to the president. So that could take anywhere from a few months to years, right, Erin?
Yeah.
It's very interesting. So there's been a lot of talk about rescheduling it down to like a 3, which would be comparative to maybe ibuprofen, which we have a prescription level of. We also have an over-the-counter level of, or totally descheduling, which then would take into account a lot of other situations that arise with it being on Schedule 1 that would hopefully take that away. So what else would you like to add to that, Erin?
Yeah, I would just add, just really emphasize what Holly said there about the timeline kind of being open-ended. If someone tries to tell you that they know when this is going to happen, they are not to be believed. Because what a reasonable time means, and knowing how the FDA works, and the question still exists of what research are they doing to inform this? By statute, they have to put together this 8-factor analysis that Holly was referencing. And if they're looking to do their own research, that can impact the timeline significantly more than if they're looking at existing research. And also there's that consideration of, is the existing research, domestic research, good enough, representative enough, given the Schedule 1 status has created barriers to that end. And go ahead. What was that?
They use non-US research.
And that hasn't been determined. I think they can look at research, but what they're going to be using is not yet determined. And that, I think, again, because if you think about it, if they're going to start their own studies and research, that's very different than looking at what's out there.
You know, sorry, you just hit like the nail on the head on one of the biggest issues that no one realizes right there. Is you have an industry that's been locked out of doing actual FDA research.
Yep.
And
because of that Schedule 1 status.
Right. And so when most people don't realize, like, if you look at like True Pharma, right? You go through a process, you get the 2B authorization, and then you get, proof of concept, and then you get FDA approval to do actual clinical trials, right? And that's where the research and support comes in. That research doesn't necessarily exist. At best, it's anecdotal, throughout the US. So,
and we're not even getting into the fact that the domestic research that has been done has been 95% conducted from one source of cannabis produced at one approved research facility.
Right.
So it's not representative of
right.
like you would see with other things.
And it's going to be terrible if they make it a political argument too.
But with the scheduling thing, one thing I do also want to just touch on that Holly kind of alluded to is, what a potential reschedule or deschedule would look like. And I'm not going to talk about what they would mean, because there's a lot of questions to that. Like, obviously a deschedule solves all of the banking issues, right? But there also would be no regulatory structure for all the states. It would just be like federal government no longer regulates and the state is now supreme. You get interstate commerce issues, that kind of stuff. The other schedules, there's difference of opinions of what they would mean. But what I would just like to emphasize to everyone, and to Zach's point, is take a deep breath, because this process will probably result in something more than just saying cannabis is going to now live on Schedule 2 or 3 or off the schedule. This process does not preclude the administration and their agencies from taking additional actions in the interim. Like, remember with the Cole memo from DOJ back in the Obama administration, and it doesn't preclude them from issuing additional guidance and structure outside of the scheduling process. And then just two other things I just want to point out real quick, and then I'll shut up for a little bit and let the guys talk. But just also a reminder that there's been some talk about a potential Schedule 6 to create a new schedule, that would have to be done legislatively. There's also been talk about taking it out of the schedule and have it regulated like alcohol and tobacco. And there's some question about that too, because if you remember, that was also done statutorily by Congress and not administratively. So just some thoughts there in terms of what the administration can actually do based on statute, and not necessarily digging into it being a binary choice of if this schedule then X, because we've also never had it where you have something that potentially could be less regulated that already has an existing market. Like what Zach was talking about, you usually have a new drug developed, it goes through the trials, then it enters the market. We have a market, and now we're talking about how to regulate it federally.
Yeah, I think there's a couple points. One, if you look at a country like Israel, where they like focused on R&D first and couldn't figure out the commercialization, the US went the opposite way. We skipped R&D and went straight to commercialization. So this is kind of a case of first impression when it comes to issues like this. I may be completely in the minority. I don't know. I am praying they don't reschedule, personally. I think rescheduling will end up causing more harm. Now, and what I say that with a caveat, if they reschedule and don't provide policy behind it, there's a big problem.
Yes.
If they reschedule with meaningful policy, then we can make it work. But what most people don't realize is if they reschedule, say, to a 2 or a 3, every dispensary in the United States is, and I know they already are, but is technically violating federal law, because they would then have to go get an FDA approval. And I just find it very hard to believe that if the federal government is going to go through the process to ultimately reschedule, get DEA and FDA on board for rescheduling, that DEA and FDA are not going to want to take a role in how the process is handled. Kind of to what Erin was talking about, I would personally love to see cannabis move to with the TTB, the Tax and Trade Bureau. So that's an alcohol and tobacco model, because you could have meaningful regulation. You could keep the state regulatory framework. If the choice is complete descheduling or rescheduling, I would rather see personally descheduling, because I don't know how you reschedule unless you have meaningful policy reform without turning the industry completely on its head. To Erin's last point, I don't know what can be done that ultimately will not eventually require some legislative action. You know, it seems inevitable that there is a need. Now, it could very well be that the president's thought is, if I push through, like almost like a legislative game of chicken, if I push through meaningful change to say, we're going to go ahead and reschedule, that maybe Congress will say, uh-oh, we've got to actually do something. Kind of what we were talking about on the state level with ballot initiatives, that they don't want to be shown up.
So Zach, with that said, if the Senate goes Republican, do you think legalization will get pushed through?
I don't think it's not that. Here's the thing. It's not that I think that there are so many Republicans that are ideologically against it. It's that I don't think it's anywhere near a priority for them.
Yeah.
Right. Look, you have to think politicians want to do, as much as they are in business to help their constituents, they're in business to stay in office too. If you are a politician in Arkansas, and I'm just using that, I have nothing against politicians in Arkansas, but if you are a senator or a congressman from Arkansas, and you just had a ballot initiative fail, maybe, you know, by a slim margin, but fail, what is the incentive for you to do that?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I kind of come back to you look at gambling, right? Gambling was set up on a state level model, right? The federal government still doesn't have clear, concise policy as good as it could on federal legalized gambling. So do I think that if the Republican Party does take control of the Senate, it is less likely, any kind of reform is less likely to happen? Yeah. But I think it's more because they don't have It's just not a priority. But this also gets to some of the a really important issue, that the difference in types of policy, right? There's the let's go for a home run and catch everything policy, and then there's the incremental change, let's fix one problem policy. I think, to the Democrats' fault, too much they've tried to say we're going to go for a home run and do a big umbrella policy that fixes all the cannabis woes, irregular, policy wise. That's a terrible, it doesn't work, right? Why not go after small things? Fix 280E, make veterans have access, create more, availability for scientific research program. I mean, there's so many smaller incremental things.
Well, and so that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Safe banking has run into a number of roadblocks and hiccups, right? Because of that very issue, right? Trying to put, certainly what Republicans see as too many items into something, making it far too broad, far too wide reaching than would be comfortable for many other, for many legislators. So I'd be curious to know, and Anthony, I obviously want to hear, your take on safe banking and what is the status right now? It's been lingering out there for quite some time. Where are we at? What's that looking like?
Lingering, yes. It's passed the House 7 times, and it's been in front of us for months at this point. And I think what's important here, I think if we take a step back for a second, if the majorities in Congress change hands, will it completely kill reform? No. I think that it's important to emphasize that, at least from the ABA's perspective, as it relates to safe banking, and I think from other advocates from other aspects, I don't think it will change the fact that reform will not be pushed. Regardless of where we stand, I know the ABA, like most Americans, feels that it is far past time to help, at least if nothing else, to kind of correct the discrepancy between state law and federal law as it relates to cannabis. And I know from the ABA's perspective, we're going to continue to fight to get it in, whether it's an NDA, Omni, or something else standalone. I do think the calculus becomes a little bit more difficult when you run into a new majority where they have had their policy priorities kind of on the back burner for the past 2 years. And I think that will play a role in it. But that's, again, you have to look too in the Senate, right? You had 42 co-sponsors of safe banking. So again, it's not that the support's not there. In the House, you had 182. I think I might be off by that number by a little bit, but it's somewhere around that amount. And then at the final passage this last time, there were over 300 members of Congress that voted in favor of it. So again, it's not that the support's not there, and it's not that I don't think that different groups will not continue to push for it. But the calendar is going to become an issue, the same way the calendar is going to continue to be the biggest kind of hindrance with getting SAFE done in this Congress. We have, I mentioned NDAA, you have the Omni, the CR most likely in there, and then
that's the
yeah, exactly. And then and no less than 20 judicial nominees that will be considered. So the calendar is extremely tight. I don't think that changes the calculus, at least on the ABA side, to continue to fight for this, because it makes no sense to not bring an industry into the most highly regulated, arguably the most highly regulated industry in the world, and that's the US banking financial system. So there's no downside to it. I think legislators see that. I think it's just about continuing to push to get it there, and that's where we're at. It's been a long road. I know Erin, back in the day, when I think there were other organizations lobbying for cannabis, and I was on the Hill at that time too, it's not that they weren't taken seriously, but it was never even close to being a priority. I think now you've seen that shift. I think that it is a priority. I think you have congressional caucuses dedicated to the industry in and of itself. So that's a long-winded way of saying SAFE is here. We're still advocating for SAFE. There is a chance that SAFE morphs into a SAFE Plus package, which is looking increasingly likely. What that package entails is, at this point, is just whispers. There's no official language for it. We've heard, 3 or 4 pieces of legislation that may be added to it. The only downside to that is what's added, because what's added could be detrimental to the overall support of SAFE that has garnered bipartisan, bicameral support across the board, overwhelming, particularly in today's environment.
Hey, Jesse, can I ask a question? Possible? And I guess this is Erin, because you're on the pulse right there. Given the fact that there wasn't this red wave, but we still don't know who controls Congress, do you genuinely think that a lame duck Congress is going to pass any meaningful reform?
Yes.
That's
100%.
impressive. You would know better than anybody. So
I
that's
will
why I asked.
say that when even the red wave was expected, the conversations, and I know Anthony's been having a lot of these conversations as well, when we've been talking to folks on the Hill about Safe and Safe Plus, both sides of the aisle, both chambers, no one was saying this may not happen. They were saying, we don't know what it looks like yet. We don't know what it looks like yet because we don't know what the next Congress is going to look like. But what my boss is committed to is getting it across the finish line. And you're hearing that across the board. And you're hearing, we're not going to not support at least Safe has passed the House 7 times before the end of the Congress. And I think honestly, having the narrower majorities in both chambers, no matter how the cookies crumble, no matter how's in charge, it's forcing everyone in this situation to realize that they cannot overplay their hand in terms of what Anthony was trying to get at, in terms of what can be added before you start losing votes. Because at the end of the day, this has passed the House 7 times. What we need is the math in the Senate. What can pass the Senate with 60 votes? And we know there's agreement on Safe. We know that there's agreement on exchange access. We know that there's some consensus and support for things in more of a plus outside of banking per se, in terms of some expungements, veterans, research, the kind of things Zach was talking about before. It's just, what does this final thing look like that will keep the support but cross the finish line? It's likely not going to be a standalone bill. The calendar is against us, as Anthony said. But if y'all recall, in the lame duck last cycle before President Biden assumed office, the omnibus was a vehicle for a very large COVID relief bill. I think there was some disaster relief in there as well. This is literally the kitchen drawer where they throw everything that didn't get done and they've run out of days for it, and things that people agree on and no need to get done. And the fact of the matter is that you have almost half of the US population living in states where cannabis in some way, shape, or form is legal. Folks know that more needs to be done on all these different little nuanced pieces of it. But the worst thing that could be done is to not act. That's the worst thing you can do for the existing industry. That's the worst thing you can do to make sure that there's equitable growth in the industry moving forward. That's the worst thing that you can do for consumer safety. The time is now, and those leaders are there, and those leaders, no cannabis leaders in Congress lost. You didn't see any of the people who are out there on these bills that aren't coming back. So you really have, I feel like, this sense of urgency and this agreement that something needs to get done and something will likely get done. It's just what it looks like is the question mark.
Zach, I think it's safe to say that there would be a lot of members of Congress that would be relieved that if they did not have to talk to the ABA about safe banking again, if it passed. I think that is beyond a fair assessment. I think, as Erin mentioned a little bit, it may not pass as a standalone bill. It will likely not pass as a standalone bill, at least not in this Congress. But if it were to be called for a vote, it would be a lopsided.
It would pass. Yeah,
Oh,
we're not saying it wouldn't pass
Yes.
because it doesn't have the support. If the Senate had brought it up any of the times the House voted, it would have passed these past 2 years. It's just that it hasn't, and it's the calendar that's going to prevent it as a standalone.
Exactly.
Good point.
You would look at a
Anthony, I'm
passage
sorry.
in the Senate that is over 60 votes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
At the end of the
Yeah,
day,
I
for
think
for
everyone
safe
agrees on
alone.
that.
Yeah. Good clarification. Sorry about that, Anthony.
It's all good.
Anthony, I'd be curious to hear from your perspective, how are big banks versus small regional banks looking at safe banking or even just cannabis access more broadly? And what's the narrative there, and how are you guys helping people understand the implications of even banking cannabis at all?
So sure. So I think if we take a step back, I think you've seen some states, Pennsylvania in particular, took an extra step and passed their own version of safe banking for state chartered banks. That does nothing for nationally chartered banks, but it was a step for them to show at least one of their sitting senators that they do support this initiative. I think what you're seeing across the country, if and when SAFE passes, I think you will see more banks get involved into the industry. I don't think you will see universal adoption. I don't think you will see it happen overnight. I think what you will start to see is banks taking the harder look at what compliance costs are going to be associated, what compliance regime in general is going to be involved to satisfy things like know your customer, AML and money laundering type situations. I know that Holly could probably speak to some of those as a former banker herself. What we've seen, and again, the ABA represents banks that range from community banks all the way up to the GSIBs, the largest banks in the country. And I think you've seen from our advocacy that there is broad support across the industry for getting this across the line, because if nothing else, there is interest in being able to remove some of the ambiguity. I guess I'm trying to choose my words here carefully. The ambiguity involved with some clients that may not be directly cannabis touching, but peripherally related, that theoretically could be roped up into adverse actions under current law and under the current regime. So I think you would see broad, very broad support, almost universal support as it comes to that. But I want to caution, because as much as we talk about, as much as we see the support for it across the board, I want to caution because, and say this again, that just because SAFE passes does not mean the next day that you're going to have banks that are taking cannabis deposits. That's not going to be the case. In the long term, it will be, but it's not going to be the case the day after.
So,
And just to emphasize that point by Anthony, it is a very important and impactful policy that must get across the finish line. It's well beyond time for it to be signed into law. But there is still the cost of compliance for banks that folks need to understand, both on the bank and on the client side of things. But it's that legitimacy question. And again, the sense that you will not be cracked down on for serving cannabis exclusively. And, there are other things that can be done on the banking side, as I mentioned with Safe Plus, considerations of provisions that would open up the US senior exchanges so that the cannabis companies you see now that are having to list on these junior exchanges in Canada have the same access to the US stock exchange as foreign cannabis companies have currently. And what that really does too is, for the small business that's looking to get an investment for their startup, if they have a more accurate benchmark off of the senior exchange listing domestic cannabis companies, they are more fairly valued. Right now, their value and their investments are hampered by the fact that valuations for domestic cannabis companies are undervalued pretty significantly on the Canadian exchanges. So there are other things that can go further on the banking side of things, just like there are other things that need to be done outside of banking when we're looking at cannabis reform overall. So there will still be those fights moving forward.
I think Erin just made such an important point. And it's important to also remember, safe banking passes, marijuana is still illegal, right? So there are, I think SAFE is an amazing gesture and symbol, but from a strict regulatory framework, the industry is still banked. There are banks. I can find you a bank in every legal market in the country. It's just there's not an overabundance of banks. Not every bank on the corner. I think SAFE will have the impact of potentially opening up the capital markets greater. And to me, the greatest hindrance of legal cannabis industry is actually the exchanges. We joked about it the other day. To me, it's the biggest irony and potential hypocrisy that one of the largest financial institutions banking almost exclusively cannabis is traded on NASDAQ, but its clients can't be traded on NASDAQ. Its customers can't be traded on NASDAQ. So I just think, it's interesting because personally, I don't think the exchanges need federal policy change to actually change their policy of allowing plant touching. For those that don't know, NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange have had a policy that U.S. plant touching operators cannot be listed on their exchanges. Many that I've talked to in my circles believe they're waiting for something like SAFE or some federal policy
Climate explicitly allows for exchange access.
Climate would be perfect. Yeah, climate would be perfect. But I think they're all waiting. They're waiting for something. That being said, the minute that the exchanges open up, we are going to see a diametric change in the industry, because then the blue chip U.S. industry companies that have all been dancing around the edges wanting to get in, not just Scott's Miracle-Gro, but Coca-Cola, P&G, every other CPG company you can imagine that has been dancing around the idea of being a cannabis industry hasn't. To me, that's an even bigger policy change or a change that we need than SAFE. I hate to say that.
No, Zach, I hear that, and I'm not gonna outright disagree with it. What I'm gonna say though is, and I'm searching for the analogy in my head, and it's like the cart leading the horse or something. But with SAFE's passage, I think that there will be a certain level of understanding across the board. I'll say legitimacy that's put out there that will then help to spur 100%. Some of these other changes that may or may not need to be done.
I 100% agree with you.
Yeah, would not hurt anything. I think the passage of SAFE only helps to get to move the conversation forward and to help the industry and its clients and a number of other issues move forward. So I think that's.
I'm not a SAFE naysayer. I'm just, by any stretch, I think it's important. I think it needs to pass. I just think there are so many ancillary issues that stem off of SAFE that people also need to consider.
Sure.
And I do agree with you. I think if SAFE passes, I am a believer that may be the catalyst that gets the exchanges off their hide to say, yeah, we'll let them trade here. Hopefully, knock on wood.
And I can go back to the fact that, if the Senate had passed SAFE when it passed the House the first time, the industry was not where it is today, right? And I think that's what you're really trying to get to, Zach, is like there are so many ancillary issues now that have popped up that when SAFE was first passed, it should have been law already. It should be. We still need it. It's still important. But there are so many more issues that had arisen given the growth of this industry while there's been federal inaction.
Correct. Yeah, I agree with 100%. Absolutely.
I tell you guys this every time we talk. I could listen to you all day, but I do want to be mindful of time. But one question actually that we just received, and I'm curious to hear everyone's take, knowing that we just have a couple minutes left. Is there any level of legalization or movement on cannabis in other areas of the world, Europe, Latin America? Obviously, we know what's happening in Germany. That would create a catalyst for faster change here in the States, or is the U.S. solely focused on what we're doing here?
You have 38 states that have already passed it here, and sure, that hasn't spurred anything. I would be hard pressed to see any foreign or non-US based legalization that would push US legislators to do anything.
Yeah, I mean, you look at like kind of countries like Germany, other European countries, even though they may be going adult use, they're still years behind. They're still a few years behind where the US is on infrastructure, framework, and regulatory scheme. I think from an international scope, the only thing that may potentially spur, on the US side is if you see a complete change on the UN drug control policy. Because so many foreign countries rely on, you talk to people that operate in Europe, in Australia or wherever, and they don't understand the US framework because they basically say, we go off the UN drug control policy, right? That's their consideration. So if the UN changes its policy completely, maybe, but to Anthony's point, no.
That's where I was going to go to. Jesse, is kind of where Zach went there, is going back to what the president announced, and this is one thing that we kind of didn't touch on when we talked about this process. So, you know, the Attorney General asked HHS for this analysis. They have to do this analysis in a quote unquote reasonable time. They give that back. DOJ is bound by the scientific and medical findings and recommendations of HHS, but the DEA has to consider treaty implications. And the reason why I didn't touch on that before, and I think we haven't touched on it, but to this point it can, is there are other countries, Canada, that have legalized cannabis, and you haven't seen action. I think maybe like China and Russia sent a letter to Canada and were like, stop that. But it's an interesting situation because I feel like the reason why this policy is in place too was because of a lot of US advocacy for it during the war on drugs, right? So that is a factor that could be influenced by, if more countries are doing it, the US wouldn't be standing alone in that situation. Again, having seen that there's not really been any negative actions in response to other countries coming online, I don't think it's that huge of a influence, but it does play a role in this depending on how DOJ interprets that. The other thing I would say, which not to continue coming back to the exchange access, but I think you will see more foreign companies are able to list on the US stock exchange because they don't have operations in the US, which also means they're not supporting any US jobs, are able to take advantage of our stock market, our exchanges, while our own companies are not. And that is a matter of fairness that I really would hope that Congress would see the need to rectify, because again, it does have such an impact on your startups being able to finance without having to give away equity in their companies right out the gate.
Thank you. I will invite a couple of people, if you want to raise your hand, use the raise hand function. We maybe have time for one more question. We did get a question from David Weiss, curious about veteran access. And I think Anthony and Erin, this is what you guys were talking about with Safe Plus, that there is already some language kind of floating out there that would allow for special access for people who have served, who are seeking alternative treatments to PTSD and the like. Is that accurate?
There is a rumor that a bill by Senator Tester would be included in Safe Plus that does address that. Yes.
Great.
Isn't there an irony to the fact that, well, also certain members of Congress that are in charge of those committees are not cannabis supporters or not as vocal? I may be thinking about a certain member of Congress down in my neck of the woods, but you know, that, do you think, to me it seems like the most obvious, getting veteran support for PTSD and other like, but how much opposition has there been from the left and the right?
I will say that we, in tandem with ABA's advocacy, we've encountered several veterans groups that are knocking on the doors and doing that, and they are doing, quote unquote, they're doing God's work because they're the best messengers for that. If the ABA were to go in there and talk about veterans, I think it would be less effective than if veterans are going in there talking about veterans. And from what we've heard in our discussions with them, they've been seeing success and starting to bring members of both parties more in line and understanding with the real life implications associated with passage of some kind of legalization.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, I think we are up on time. We're actually over time. So thank you all for spending a few more minutes with us. This was incredibly interesting, very insightful. I'm hoping we can continue these conversations as we see more evolution. Like I said, it happens hourly, so maybe we'll try and put a regular cadence so we can get updates from you guys Can't tell you how much we all appreciate the time. Thank you all, the audience, for joining us today. Recording of this will be out within the next 24 hours. So if there's anybody else you think that would benefit from viewing this, please obviously pass that along. Otherwise, we will see you all at the next State of Play webinar. Thanks again for being here.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.